English transmission on Now TV International, coming to you live with Panorama News, bringing you the latest updates in politics, economics, and sports. I'm Ibrahim Kabir, and first, the political headlines are coming up. Daesh terrorist attack on Syria army bus kills 26 soldiers. West Africa army chiefs to meet in coming days to discuss Niger plans. And Russia ups pressure on northeast Ukraine. Welcome back, and kicking off today's round, at least 26 soldiers have been killed in war-torn Syria's east, the deadliest in a new wave of attacks blamed on the terrorist group of Daesh. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the terrorists surrounded the bus and opened fire in Deir ez-Zor province's Mayadin area in Syria's vast Badia desert. 11 other soldiers were wounded, with some in critical condition, while troops previously thought to be missing were on other buses that managed to reach safe areas. The official Syrian news agency Sana said the terrorist attack had caused a number of military casualties, citing an unidentified army sources. Despite losing the last piece of territory in Syria in 2019, Daesh has maintained hideouts in the vast Syrian deserts from which it has carried out ambushes and hit and run attacks. To the Middle East, Israeli occupation forces shot dead a Palestinian during an assault on a refugee camp in the West Bank on Friday. Palestinian medics said the Palestinian man who was martyred sustained a gunshot wound in the chest and that at least 8 people were wounded. Fatah movement identified the martyr as Mahmoud Jarrad. It said he was a member, but it did not claim him as a fighter. Violence in the West Bank has worsened over the past 15 months amid stepped-up Israeli occupation raids, rampages by illegal Israeli settlers on Palestinian villages, and violations at Al-Aqsa Mosque. Nearly 4 months of violent street battles between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary known as the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, have made funerals a near impossibility in Khartoum. Amid the chaos, residents and local medical groups say corpses lie rotting in the capital streets, marooned by a conflict that shows few signs of easing. There is a limited data on the casualties in Sudan. The country's health minister, Haytham Muhammad Ibrahim, said in June that the conflict has killed upward of 3,000 people, but there has been no update since. The true tally is likely far higher, according to local doctors and activists. Likewise, no medical group has provided a toll on the number of unburied corpses, with mass graves and widespread ethnic killings being uncovered in the country's southern Darfur region. The United Nations said on Friday it had completed the removal of more than 1 million barrels of oil from a decaying supertanker off Yemen's Red Sea coast, averting a potential environmental disaster. UN officials and activists have been warning for years that the entire Red Sea coastline was at risk. A devastating Safer tanker could have ruptured or exploded, spilling 4 times as much of oil as the 1989 Exxon Valdez disaster off Alaska. The war in Yemen caused the suspension of maintenance operations on the Safer in 2015. The ship is used for storage and has been moored off Yemen for more than 30 years. Salvage crews operated for 18 days in a coastal conflict zone riddled with sea mines amid high summer temperatures and strong currents to offload the oil from the vessel. To Niger, West African army chiefs will meet in the coming days to prepare plans for a possible military intervention in Niger, as concern grew over the detention conditions of ousted President Mohamed Bazoum. An ECOWAS spokesperson for the regional bloc said Friday the bloc ordered the activation of a standby force on Thursday, 2 weeks after generals ousted Bazoum in the 7th attempt in the West and Central Africa in recent years. The Chiefs of Staff meeting indicates that West African nations are stepping up preparations to commit troops for a possible action to reverse the military size of power. It was not yet clear how big the force will be, how long it will take to assemble, and if it will actually invade. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, said all options were on the table and is still hoped for a peaceful resolution to the Niger crisis. Meanwhile, Russia said on Friday it had destroyed a Ukrainian drone over the western outskirts of Moscow, the latest in a growing number of aerial attacks on the capital. Largely spurred in the early part of the conflict, the capital has seen a surge in attacks in recent months. Here are more details.
Russia on Friday claimed to have improved the fighting positions around the northeast Ukraine town of Kupiansk as Kiev's troops struggle ahead with the counter-offensive in the other areas. Moscow also launched a volley of the hypersonic missiles at western Ukraine in an attack that killed an 8-year-old boy in a part of the country that has largely been spared from the attacks. Kiev said that these strikes hit a house where a family with 3 children lived near the western town of Kolomia. Kupiansk and the surrounding areas of the northeast Kharkiv region were recaptured by Kiev's forces in September, but Moscow has since pushed back into the region, forcing Ukraine to order the civilian evacuations. According to Moscow's defense ministry, Russian units had continued the offensive operations on a wide front and improved the tactical situation to the east of Kupiansk. The United Nations condemned the strike, which it said hit a hotel used by the teams and the other NGOs working in the region. Ukrainian officials in the Kupiansk region on Thursday urged the residents in 37 settlements wedged between the town and the Russian lines to evacuate the area. Russia's driving Kupiansk has sought to draw Ukrainian forces away from Kiev's own counteroffensive. Ukraine launched a highly anticipated push in June after stockpiling Western weapons, but has struggled to make headway in the face of stiff Russian resistance.
To the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Biden administration has asked the Congress to provide more than $13 billion in the emergency defense aid to Ukraine, and an additional $8 billion for humanitarian support through the end of the year. US President Joe Biden has repeatedly said the United States will help Ukraine as long as it takes to oust Russia from its borders. Ukraine was pushing through with its ongoing counteroffensive in an effort to dislodge the Kremlin's forces from territory they have occupied since a full-scale operation in February 2022. The US has approved 4 rounds of aid to Ukraine in response to Russia's operations, totaling about $113 billion, with some of that money going toward replenishment of US military equipment that was sent to the front lines. To another file. A rescue operation is underway to assist dozens of migrants on a sailboat reported in trouble off the southern coast of Greece amid a rise in migration to the Mediterranean country. 4 civilian vessels were ordered to provide assistance, while 3 Coast Guard boats and a naval ship were sent to the area. Here are the details.
Nearly 2 months after a dilapidated fishing trawler crammed with people heading from Libya to Italy sank in the central Mediterranean, killing hundreds, relatives are still frantically searching for their loved ones among the missing and the dead. Many questions remain about Greek authorities' response and exactly how and why the boat carrying an estimated 500 to 750 people capsized and sank in the early hours of June 14th in what became one of the deadliest migrant shipwrecks in the Mediterranean. Only 104 people were pulled from the sea alive, all men and boys. 82 bodies, only one of them, a woman, were recovered. The rest, including women and children, sank in one of the deepest parts of the Mediterranean with depths of around 4,000 meters in that area. Any recovery of the vessel or its victims are all but impossible. Police said that by August 7th, around 40 of the recovered bodies were identified through a painstaking process combining DNA analysis, dental records, fingerprints, and interviews with survivors and relatives. The task is complicated by the lack of information on who was on the boat and by the fact that many were from countries where, due to war and civil turmoil, relatives are struggling to provide DNA samples. For some, the lack of a body to bury means they hold out hope, however improbable, that their loved one is somehow still alive.
Official figures revealed on Friday that more than 100,000 migrants have crossed the channel on small boats from France to southeast England since Britain began publicly recording the arrival in 2018. The UK Interior Ministry statistics showed that some 755 migrants were detected Thursday, and 14 small boats headed for England's southern coast, the highest tally on a single day this year. Those boats bring the number of arrivals so far this year to nearly 16,000 and takes the total since counting the previous cross-channel journeys started in the year 2018 to 100,715. Also on Friday, officials were relocating asylum seekers from a barrage docked off the southwest English coast after Legionella bacteria was found in the water only days after the migrants had been moved abroad. Supporters of assassinated Ecuadorian presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio will host a public memorial for the slain candidate on Friday, after the Attorney General's office charged 6 suspects in his death. Villavicencio, a former lawmaker and anti-corruption journalist, was gunned down leaving a campaign event on Wednesday evening, less than 2 weeks before the election. The murder was a shocking example of rising violence and crime in the South American country and made an unsettled election even harder to forecast. 6 suspects, all Colombians, who police have said belonged to criminal groups, were remanded in custody for 30 days by a judge late on Thursday. The government has said it's pursuing the intellectual authors of the murder and has promised heightened security nationwide to ensure peaceful elections. Iran has moved 5 Americans from jail to house arrest in the first step of a delicate deal that would unfreeze billions of dollars in Iranian funds and allow the prisoners to leave Tehran. The progress on the prisoners, of them detained from nearly 8 years, comes after quite exhaustive diplomacy between the longtime adversaries, whose separate talks on restoring a nuclear deal broke down. Sources familiar with the negotiations said the next step would be the transfer of $6 billion in Iranian oil revenue frozen in South Korea to a special account in Qatar, which Iran could access only for humanitarian purchases such as food and medicine. If all goes as planned, the American prisoners could leave Iran sometimes in September. Search teams on Maui on Friday will comb through the charred ruins of Lahaina, looking for more victims of a wildfire that ripped through the kingdom of Hawaii's overtime capital, with officials expecting the death toll of 55 to rise.
A terrifying wildfire that left a historic Hawaiian town in charred ruins has killed at least 55 people, making it one of the deadliest disasters in the U.S. state's history. Brush fires in Maui, fueled by high winds from a nearby hurricane, broke out Tuesday and rapidly engulfed the seaside town of Lahaina. The flames moved so quickly that many were caught off guard, trapped in the streets or jumping into the ocean in a desperate bid to escape. The fires follow other extreme weather events in North America this summer, with record-breaking wildfires still burning across Canada and a major heat wave baking the U.S. Southwest. Europe and parts of Asia have also endured soaring temperatures, with major fires and floods wreaking havoc. Governor Josh Green said 80% of the town was gone. Maui County officials said just after 0700 GMT Friday that fatalities stood at 55 and firefighters were still battling the blaze in the town that served as the Hawaiian Kingdom's capital in the early 19th century. The burned skeletons of trees still stand, rising above the ashes of the buildings to which they once offered shelter. Thousands have been left homeless, and Green said a massive operation was swinging into action to find accommodation. American President Joe Biden on Thursday declared the fires a major disaster and unblocked federal aid for relief efforts, with rebuilding expected to take years. U.S. Coast Guard Commander Aya Kursky told CNN around 100 people were believed to have jumped into the water in a desperate effort to flee the fast-moving flames as they tore through Lahaina. Kursky said helicopter pilots struggled to see because of dense smoke, but that a Coast Guard vessel had been able to rescue more than 50 people from the water. As global temperatures rise over the time, heat waves are projected to become more frequent, with increased dryness due to changing rainfall patterns, creating ideal conditions for bush or forest fires.
In China, severe floods in China's northern province of Hebei, brought by remnants of Typhoon Doksuri this month, killed at least 29 people and caused billions of dollars in economic losses. Official news agency Xinhua reported that rescue crews were still searching for 16 missing people, and the province's reconstruction is expected to take 2 years to complete. Initial estimates showed the province's direct economic losses amounted to 13.2 billion US dollars. Last week, Hebei was hit by serious flooding, and the remnants of the typhoon battered the region and brought the heaviest rainfall in neighboring Beijing in at least 140 years. Official early results estimates announced Friday showed 3.9 million residents, or about 5% of the province's population, were being affected by the floods, and more than 40,000 houses were collapsed. A rocket carrying a lunar landing craft blasted off Friday on Russia's first moon mission in nearly 50 years, racing to land on Earth's satellite ahead of an Indian spacecraft. The launch from Russia's Vostochny spaceport in the far east of the Luna 25 craft to the moon is Russia's first since 1976, when it was part of the Soviet Union. The Russian lunar lander is expected to reach the moon on August 23rd, about the same day as an Indian craft which was launched on July 14th. The Russian spacecraft will take about 5.5 days to travel to the moon's vicinity, then spend 3 to 7 days orbiting at about 100,000 kilometers before heading for the surface. Only 3 governments have managed successful moon landings: the Soviet Union, the United States, and China. India and Russia are aiming to be the first to land at the moon's south pole. And finally, the Equestrian Valley fields affiliated to the Ministry of Interior hosted recently Egypt Cup and the state's competition of tent pegging. The participants hailed the well-organized 2-day event and extended their thanks to the Interior Ministry for the all-afforded facilities. They said the perfect arrangement had given them the chance to enjoy their favorite sports, particularly with the unique geographic location of the valley, in the Fustat area of Old Cairo. The Equestrian Valley hosted in January the 10th Begging World Cup with the participation of scores of knights coming from all over the globe. That's all for the political news. Coming up next are the economic headlines. IEA raises world oil demand forecast in 2023. China's July new bank loans tumble. And Brazil's consumer prices barely rise in July. Welcome back. Eurozone bond yields rose on Friday as investors took stock of a relatively weak 30-year US Treasury auction in a slight rise in US inflation. Germany's 10-year bond yield, the benchmark for the Eurozone, was last up 5 basis points at 2.578%. The 10-year US Treasury yield rose 7 basis points on Thursday and was up another 2 BPS on Friday at 4,000.99%. Bond yields rise as prices fall and vice versa. Data on Thursday showed that US inflation edged up to a year-on-year rate of 3.2% in July from 3% in June, although economists expected a rise to 3.3%. Germany's 2-year bond yield, which is sensitive to interest rate expectations, was last up 2 basis points at 2.989%. Longer data, US and European bond yields have risen over the last few weeks. Analysts have cited a number of factors, including relatively resilient growth in major economies. The International Energy Agency, IEA, on Friday said demand growth for oil next year will be slower than previously forecast. The Paris-based energy watchdog said in its August monthly oil market report, growth is forecast to slow to 1 million barrels per day in 2024, down by 150,000 barrels per day from its previous forecast. The IEA said the global economic outlook remains challenging in the face of soaring interest rates and tighter bank credit, squeezing businesses that are already having to cope with the sluggish manufacturing and trade. Tighter supply has underpinned a rally in oil prices, with Brent crude trading above $88 a barrel, its highest since January. The IEA warned global inventories could draw down sharply over the rest of 2023, potentially driving prices still higher. In 2023, global oil demand is set to expand by 2.2 million barrels per day, buoyed by summer air travel, increased oil use in power generation, and surging Chinese petrochemical activity. Still in the economic news, official data showed Friday that Britain's economy expanded slightly over the second quarter thanks to strong output in June and despite inflation remaining high. The Office for National Statistics, ONS, said in a statement that gross domestic product grew 0.2% in the April to June period after output expanded 0.1% in the first quarter. The economy grew by stronger than expected 0.5% in June, sending the pound higher against the dollar in early London trading. The data was a boost also for the Conservative government, forecast to lose power in a general election due next year as Britain struggles with the cost of living crisis. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has made it a government priority to get UK annual inflation down to 5% by the end of 2023, around half the rate it was at the start of the year. US consumer prices increased moderately in July, as higher rents were mostly offset by declining costs of goods such as motor vehicles and furniture, a trend that could persuade the US Federal Reserve to leave interest rates unchanged next month. The details.
The American consumer prices increased moderately in July as higher rents were mostly offset by the declining costs of the goods such as the motor vehicles and furniture, a trend that would persuade the US Federal Reserve to leave the interest rates unchanged next month. The report from the American Labor Department also showed underlying inflation pressures subsided further last month. The annual increase in prices excluding the volatile food and energy components, the so-called core inflation, was the smallest in nearly 2 years. Moderate inflation, together with the cooling labor market, bolstered the economist's conviction that the U.S. Central Bank will be able to engineer a soft landing for the economy after a year of hand-wringing about the recession. The consumer price index rose 0.2% last month, matching the gain in June. Shelter accounted for more than 90% of the increase in the CPI, with the rental costs increasing 0.4%. Food prices gained 0.2%. Grocery food prices increased 0.3% after being unchanged in June. They were boosted by the higher prices for eggs, beef, dairy, as well as the fruit and vegetables. Still, grocery store prices have slowed considerably, increasing 3.6% on a year-on-year basis in July, after peaking at 13.5% in August of 2022. Restaurant meal prices rose 0.2%, slowing back to pre-pandemic trends. The cost of energy products edged up 0.1%, with gasoline prices rising slightly. A jump in prices at the pump in late July will likely to be reflected in the August inflation report. The CPI advanced 3.2% in the 12 months through July, and that followed a 3% rise in June, which was the smallest year-on-year gain since March of 2021.
In China, China's new bank loans tumbled in July. from a month earlier, and other key credit goals also weakened, even after policymakers cut interest rates and promised to roll out more support for the faltering economy. Data from the People's Bank of China showed on Friday that Chinese banks extended 345.9 billion yuan or 47.8 billion US dollars of new yuan loans in July, tumbling 89% from June and falling far short of analysts' forecast. Analysts had expected new loans last month to fall sharply from 3.05 trillion yuan in June to 800 billion yuan after record lending in the first half as the central bank tried to shore up sputtering demand and investment. The reading was also much lower than 679 billion yuan in July 2022. While lending in China typically tends to fall back in July for seasonal reasons, the weak credit readings come days after the other green data have slipped into inflation last month, while exports and imports plummeted, adding pressure on Beijing to roll out more forceful stimulus measures. Floods have damaged corn and rice crops in China's key northern grain-producing belt. With more rain in the forecast as another typhoon approaches, threatening to add to global food inflation pressure. The hit to China's cereal crops, the full extent of which is not yet clear, comes as consumers worldwide face tightening food supplies amid India's ban on rice exports last month and disruptions in Black Sea grain shipments caused by the war in Ukraine. Initial estimates show 4 million to 5 million metric tons of corn, about 2% of the country's output, have been affected by the floods. Floods are also likely to reduce rice output. Fitch ratings on Friday and heavy rain in China's grain-producing region is likely to put upward pressure on the global rice prices. Rice prices have already climbed more than 20% since India announced its ban on exports of non-basmati white rice. Singapore on Friday cut its economic growth forecast for this year owing to weak demand from key export marketing, including China and the United States. The Southeast Asian nation's performance is often seen as a barometer of the global environment because of its reliance on international trade. Data showing forecast beating second quarter growth helped the city-state escape a recession, but analysts have warned that it faced headwinds in the back end of the year. The Ministry of Trade and Industry on Friday said it had narrowed its economic growth forecast this year to 1.5% from a previous estimate of 0.5 to 2.5%. The ministry said that despite the reopening of China, the world's second biggest economy, and other positive global trends, downside risks to the world economy remained. It cited persistently high inflation that could crimp global spending and potential supply disruptions. And finally, in Brazil's consumer prices barely rose on the month in July, with an unexpected drop in food costs, countered by a probable rise in gasoline bills after the reinstatement of a federal tax on fuels. The IPCA inflation index is forecast to have edged up 0.07% last month, according to the median estimate of 21 economists, following a negative 0.08% reading in June that will lift the annual rate to 3.393% from 3.16%. However, that expected pickup is related to base effects rather than any reactivation of deeper inflationary pressures, in line with the Brazilian Central Bank's plan to carry on a string of moderate rate cuts after an initial move last week. Brazil is enjoying beginning food inflation trends resulting from a record-breaking crop that may be repeated next season, provided the country's vast production of grains and oilseeds is spared from the impact of a ninoclimatic pattern. That's all for the economic news. Coming up next are the sports headlines, so stay tuned. Egypt among top 4